The Cosmic Expense Account, Cyril Michael Kornbluth. The Lackawanna was still running one cautious morning train a day into Scranton, though the city was said to be emptying fast. Professor Luton and I had a coach to ourselves, except for a scared, jittery trainman who hung around and talked at us. "The name's Beck," he said. "And let me tell you, the Petches have been around for a mighty long time in these parts. There's a town 23 miles north of Scranton named Beckville, full of my cousins and aunts and uncles, and I used to visit there, and we used to send picture postcards and get them, too." "But my God, mister, what's happened to them?" His question was rhetorical. He didn't realize that Professor Luton and I happened to be the only two people outside the Miscalled Plague area who could probably answer it. "Mr. Beck," I said, "if you don't mind, we'd like to talk some business." "Sorry," he said miserably, and went on to the next car. When we were alone, Professor Luton remarked, "An interesting reaction." He was very smooth about it. Without the slightest warning he whipped a huge, writhing, hairy spider from his pocket and thrust it at my face. I was fast on the draw too. In one violent fling I was standing on my left foot in the aisle, thumbing my nose, my tongue stuck out. Goose flesh rippled down my neck and shoulders. "Very good," he said, and put the spider away. It was damnably realistic. Even knowing that it was a gadget of twisted springs and plush, I cringed at the thought of its nestling in his pocket. With me it was spiders. With the professor it was rats and asphyxiation. Toward the end of our mutual training program it took only 1 part per million of sulfur dioxide gas in his vicinity to send him whirling into the posture of defense, crane-like on one leg, tongue out and thumb to nose, the sweat of terror on his brow. "I have something to tell you, Professor," I said. "So?" he asked tolerantly. And that did it. The tolerance. I had been prepared to make my point with a dignified recital and apology, but there were two ways to tell the story and I suddenly chose the second. "You're a phony," I said with satisfaction. "What?" he gasped. "A phony. A fake. A hoaxer. A self-deluding crackpot. Your functional epistemology is a farce. Let's not go into this thing kidding ourselves." His accent thickened a little. "Let me remind you, Mr. Norris, that you are addressing a Doctor of Philosophy of the University of Göttingen and a member of the faculty of the University of Basel. You mean a private docent who teaches freshman logic. And I seem to remember that Göttingen revoked your degree," he said slowly. "I have known all along that you were a fool, Mr. Norris. Not until now did I realize that you are also an anti-Semite. It was the Nazis who went through an illegal ceremony of revocation, so that makes me an anti-Semite. From a teacher of logic that's very funny." "You are correct," he said after a long pause. "I withdraw my remark. Now, would you be good enough to amplify yours?" "Gladly, Professor." In the first place, I had been winding up the rubber rat in my pocket. I yanked it out and tossed it into his lap where it scrabbled and clawed. He yelled with terror, but the yell didn't cost him a split second. Almost before it started from his throat he was standing one-legged, thumb to nose, tongue stuck out. He thanked me coldly, I congratulated him coldly, I pocketed the rat while he shuddered and we went on with the conversation. I told him how, 18 months ago, Mr. Hopedale called me into his office. Nice office, oak panels, signed pictures of Hopedale press writers from our glorious past, Kipling, Barrie, Theodore Roosevelt and the rest of the backlog boys. "What about Eno Illiken?" Mr. Hopedale wanted to know. Eno was one of our novelists. His first, Vinland the Good, has been a critical success and a popular flop. Cubs of the Viking Breed, the sequel, made us all a little money. He was now a month past delivery date on the final volume of the trilogy and the end was not in sight. I think he's pulling a sit-down strike, Mr. Hopedale. He's way overdrawn now and I had to refuse him a $1,000 advance. He wanted to send his wife to the Virgin Islands for a divorce. "Give him the money," Mr. Hopedale said impatiently. "How can you expect the man to write when he's beset by personal difficulties?" "Mr. Hopedale," I said politely, "she could divorce him right in New York State. He's given her grounds in all 5 boroughs and the western townships of Long Island. But that's not the point. He can't write. And even if he could, the last thing American literature needs right now is another trilogy about a Scandinavian immigrant family." "I know," he said. "I know. He's not very good yet but I think he's going to be, and do you want him to starve while he's getting the juvenilia out of his system?" His next remark had nothing to do with Illiken. He looked at the signed photo of T.R. to a bully publisher and said, "Norris, we're broke." I said, We owe everybody. Printer, paper mill, warehouse. Everybody. It's the end of Hopedale Press. Unless, I don't want you to think people have been reporting on you, Morris, but I understand you came up with an interesting idea at lunch yesterday. Some Swiss professor. I had to think hard. You must mean Luton, Mr. Hopedale. No, there's nothing in it for us, sir. I was joking. My brother, he teaches philosophy at Columbia, mentioned him to me. Luton's a crackpot. Every year or two Weintraub Verlagenball brings out another volume of his Watchamacat and they sell about 1,000. Functional epistemology, my brother says it's all nonsense, the kind of stuff vanity presses put out. It was just a gag about us turning him into a Schweitzer or a Toynbee and bringing out a one-volume condensation. People just buy his books, I suppose, because they got started and feel ashamed to stop. Mr. Hopedale said, "Do it, Norris. Do it. We can scrape together enough cash for one big promotion and then the end. I'm going to see Brewster of Commercial Factors in the morning. I believe he will advance us 65% on our accounts receivable." He tried on a cynical smile. It didn't become him. "Norris, you are what is technically called a publisher's bright young man. We can get $750 for a scholarly book. With luck and promotion we can sell in the 100,000s. Get on it." I nodded, feeling sick, and started out. Mr. Hopedale said in a tired voice, "And it might actually be work of some inspirational value." Professor Luton sat and listened, red-faced, breathing hard. "You betrayer," he said at last. "You with the smiling face that came to Bile, that talked of lectures in America, that told me to sign your damnable contract. My face on the cover of the Time magazine that looks like a monkey, the idiotic interviews, the press releasements in my name that I never saw. America, I thought, and held my tongue. But from the beginning it was a lie." He buried his face in his hands and muttered, "Yuck. You stink. That reminded me." I took a small stench bomb from my pocket and crushed it. He leapt up, balanced on one leg and thumbed his nose. His tongue was out 4 inches and he was panting with the terror of asphyxiation. "Very good," I said, "thank you." I suggest we moved to the other end of the car. We and our luggage were settled before he began to breathe normally. I judged that the panic and the most of his anger had passed. "Professor," I said cautiously, "I've been thinking of what we do when and if we find Miss Phoebe. We shall complete her re-education," he said. "We shall point out that her unleashed powers have been dysfunctionally applied. I can think of something better to do than completing her education. It's why I spoke a little harshly. Presumably Miss Phoebe considers you the greatest man in the world." He smiled reminiscently and I knew what he was thinking. "La Plume, Pa. Wednesday 4 a.m. Professor Conrad Luton C. O. The Hopedale Press, New York City, New York. My dear Professor. Though you are a famous and busy man, I do hope you will take time to read a few words of grateful tribute from an old lady, 84. I have just finished your magnificent and inspirational book, How to Live on the Cosmic Expense Account, An Introduction to Functional Epistemology. Professor, I believe. I know every splendid word in your book is true. If there is one chapter finer than the others, it is number 9, How to Be in Utter Harmony with Your Environment. The 12 rules in that chapter shall from this minute be my guiding light, and I shall practice them faithfully forever. Your grateful friend, Miss Phoebe Bancroft. That flattering letter reached us on Friday, one day after the papers reported with amusement or dismay the blackout of La Plume, Pennsylvania. The term plague area came later. "I suppose she might," said the professor. "Well, think about it." The train slowed for a turn. I noticed that the track was lined with men and women. And some of them, by God, were leaping for the moving train. Brakes went on with a squeal and jolt. My nose bashed against the seat in front of us. "Aggression," the professor said, astonished. "But that is not in the pattern." We saw the trainman in the vestibule opening the door to yell at the trackside people. He was trampled as they swarmed aboard, filling, jamming the car in a twinkling. "Got to Scranton," we heard them saying. "Zombies. I get it," I shouted at the professor over their hubbub. "These are refugees from Scranton. They must have blocked the track. Right now they're probably bullying the engineer into backing up all the way to Wilkes-Barre. We've got to get off," he said. We were in an end seat. By elbowing, crowding, and a little slugging we got to the vestibule and dropped to the tracks. The professor lost all his luggage in the brief, fierce struggle. I saved only my briefcase. The powers of hell itself were not going to separate me from that briefcase. Hundreds of yelling, milling people were trying to climb aboard. Some made it to the roofs of the cars after it was physically impossible for one more body to be fitted inside. The locomotive uttered a despairing toot and the train began to back up. "Well," I said, "we head north." We found the United States 6 after a short overland hike and trudged along the concrete. There was no traffic. Everybody with a car had left Scranton days ago, and nobody was going into Scranton. Except us. We saw our first zombie where a signpost told us it was 3 miles to the city. She was a woman in a Mother Hubbard and sunbonnet. I couldn't tell whether she was young or old, beautiful or a hag. She gave us a sweet, empty smile and asked if we had any food. I said no. She said she wasn't complaining about her lot but she was hungry, and of course the vegetables and things were so much better now that they weren't poisoning the soil with those dreadful chemical fertilizers. Then she said maybe there might be something to eat down the road, wished us a pleasant good day and went on. Dreadful chemical fertilizers? I asked. The professor said, I believe that is a contribution by the Duchess of Carbondale to Miss Phoebe's reign. Several interviews mention it. We walked on. I could read his mind like a book. He hasn't even read the interviews. He is a foolish, an impossible young man. And yet he is here, he has undergone a rigorous course of training. He is after all risking a sort of death. Why? I let him go on wondering. The answer was in my briefcase. When do you think we'll be in range? I asked. Heaven knows. He said testily. Too many variables. Maybe it's different when she sleeps, maybe it grows at different rates varying as the number of people affected. I feel nothing yet, neither do I, and when we felt something specifically, when we felt Miss Phoebe Bancroft practicing the 12 rules of how to be in utter harmony with your environment, we would do something completely idiotic, something that had got us literally thrown out of the office of the Secretary of Defense. He had thundered at us, are you two trying to make a fool of me? Are you proposing that soldiers of the United States Army undergo a 3-month training course in sticking out their tongues and thumbing their noses? He was quivering with elevated blood pressure. 2 MP lieutenants collared us under his personal orders and tossed us down the Pentagon steps when we were unable to deny that he had stated our proposal more or less correctly, and so squads, platoons, companies, battalions and regiments marched into the plague area and never marched out again. Some soldiers stumbled out as zombies. After a few days spent at a sufficient distance from the plague area, their minds cleared and they told their confused stories. Something came over them. They said. A mental fuzziness almost impossible to describe. They liked it where they were. For instance, they left the plague area only by accident. They were wrapped in a vague, silly contentment even when they were hungry, which was usually. What was life like in the plague area? Well, not much happened. You wandered around looking for food. A lot of people looked sick but seemed to be contented. Farmers in the area gave you food with a universal silly smile, but their crops were very poor. Animal pests got most of them. Nobody seemed to eat meat. Nobody quarreled or fought or ever said a harsh word in the plague area. And it was hell on earth. Nothing conceivable could induce any of them to return. The Duchess of Carbondale. Yes, sometimes she came driving by in her chariot, wearing fluttery robes and a golden crown. Everybody bowed down to her. She was a big, fat middle-aged woman with rimless glasses and a pinched look of righteous triumph on her face. The recovered zombies at first were quarantined and doctors made their wills before going to examine them. This proved to be unnecessary and the examinations proved to be fruitless. No bacteria, no rickettsia, no viruses. Nothing. Which didn't stop them from continuing in the assumption embodied in the official name of the affected counties. Professor Luton and I knew better, of course. For knowing better we were thrown out of offices, declined interviews and once almost locked up as lunatics. That was when we tried to get through to the President direct. The Secret Service, I am able to testify, guards our chief executive with a zeal that borders on ferocity. How goes the book? Professor Luton asked abruptly. 300,000. Why? Want an advance? I don't understand German, but I can recognize deep, heartfelt profanity in any language. He spluttered and crackled for almost a full minute before he snarled in English, idiots. Dolts. Out of almost 1/3 of a million readers, exactly 1 had read the book. I wanted to defer comment on that. There's a car, I said, obviously it stalled and was abandoned by a refugee from Scranton. Let's have a look anyway. It was a battered old Ford sedan halfway off the pavement. The rear was full of canned goods and liquor. Somebody had been looting. I pushed the starter and cranked for a while. The motor didn't catch. Useless, said the professor. I ignored him, yanked the dashboard hood button and got out to inspect the guts. There was air showing on top of the gas in the sediment cup. We ride. Professor, I told him. I know these babies and their fuel pumps. The car quit on the upgrader and he let it roll back. I unscrewed the clamp of the carburetor air filter, twisted the filter off and heaved it into the roadside bushes. The professor, of course, was a mere machinery boy with a true European intellectual's contempt for greasy hands. He stood by haughtily while I poured a bottle of gin empty, found a wrench in the toolbox that fit the gas tank drain plug and refilled the gin bottle with gasoline. He condescended to sit behind the wheel and crank the motor from time to time while I sprinkled gas into the carburetor. Each time the motor coughed there was less air showing in the sediment cup. Finally the motor caught for good. I moved him over, tucked my briefcase in beside me, U-turned on the broad, empty highway and we chugged north into Scranton. It was only natural that he edged away from me, I suppose. I was grimy from working under the gas tank. This plus the discreditable ability I had shown in starting the stalled car reminded him that he was, after all, a hair doctor from a real university while I was, after all, a publisher's employee with nebulous qualifications from some place called Cornell. The atmosphere was wrong for it, but sooner or later he had to be told. "Professor, we've got to have a talk and get something straight before we find Miss Phoebe." He looked at the huge striped sign the City Fathers of Scranton wisely erected to mark that awful downgrade into the city. Warning 7-mile death trap ahead. Shift into lower gear. $50 fine. Obey or pay. What is the to get straight? He demanded. She has partially mastered functional epistemology even though Hopadil Press prefers to call it living on the cosmic expense account. This has unleashed certain latent powers of hers. It is simply our task to complete her mastery of the ethical aspect of FE. She will cease to dominate other minds as soon as she comprehends that her behavior is dysfunctional and in contravention of the principle of permissive evolution. To him the matter was settled. He mused, "Really I should not have let you cut so drastically my exposition of dyadic imbalance. That must be the root of her difficulty." A brief inductive explanation. "Professor," I said, "I thought I told you in the train that you're a fake." He corrected me loftily. "You told me that you think I'm a fake, Mr. Norris." Naturally I was angered by your duplicity. "But your opinion of me proves nothing. I ask you to look around you. Is this fakery?" We were well into the city. Bewildered dogs yelped at our car. Windows were broken and goods were scattered on the sidewalks. Here and there our house was burning brightly. Smashed and overturned cars dotted the streets, and zombies walked slowly around them. When Miss Phoebe hit a city the effects were something much like a 1,000-bomber raid. "It's not fakery," I said, staring around a smiling man in a straw hat and overalls. "It isn't functional epistemology either. It's faith in functional epistemology. It could have been faith in anything, but your book just happened to be what she settled on." "Are you daring," he demanded, white to the lips, "to compare me with the faith healers?" "Yes," I said wearily. "They get their cures. So do lots of people. Let's roll it up in a ball, Professor. I think the best thing to do when we meet Miss Phoebe is for you to tell her you're a fake. Destroy her faith in you and your system and I think she'll turn back into a normal old lady again." "Wait a minute. Don't tell me you're not a fake. I can prove you are. You say she's partly mastered FE and gets her powers from that partial mastery. Well, presumably you've completely mastered FE, since you invented it. So why can't you do everything she's done, and lots more? Why can't you end this mess by levitating to La Plume, instead of taking the Lackawanna and a 1941 Ford? And, by God, why couldn't you fix the Ford with a pass of the hands and FE instead of standing by while I worked?" His voice was genuinely puzzled. "I thought I just explained, Norris. Though it never occurred to me before, I suppose I could do what you say, but I wouldn't dream of it. As I said, it would be dysfunctional and in complete contravention of the principle of permissive." I said something very rude and added, "In short, you can but you won't." "Naturally not. The principle of permissive." He looked at me with slow awareness dawning in his eyes. "Norris. My editor. My proofreader. My by the publisher officially assigned as a chase. Norris, haven't you read my book?" "No," I said sharply. "I've been much too busy. You didn't get on the cover of Time magazine by blind chance, you know." He was laughing helplessly. "How goes that song?" he finally asked me, his eyes damp. "God Bless America." I stopped the car abruptly. "I think I feel something," I said. "Professor, I like you too, Norris," he told me. "Norris, my boy, what do you think of ladies? Delicate creatures. Custodians of culture. Professor, what about meat-eating, shocking barbarous survival? This is it, Norris." We yanked open the doors and leapt out. We stood on one foot each, thumbed our noses, and stuck out our tongues, allowing for the time on the train. This was the 1961st time I had done it in the past 2 months. 1961 times the professor had arranged for spiders to pop out at me from books, from the television screen, from under stakes, from desk drawers, from my pockets, from his. Black widows, tarantulas, harmless, ha! Big house spiders, real and imitation. 1961 times I had felt the arachnophobe's horrified revulsion. Each time I felt it I had thrown major voluntary muscular systems into play by drawing up one leg violently, swinging my hand to my nose, violently grimacing to stick out my tongue. My body had learned at last. There was no spider, his time, there was only Miss Phoebe, a vague, pleasant feeling something like the first martini. But my posture of defense this 1,962d time was accompanied by the old rejection and horror. It had no spider, so it turned on Miss Phoebe. The vague first martini feeling vanished like morning mist burned away by the sun. I relaxed cautiously. On the other side of the car so did Professor Luton. "Professor," I said, "I don't like you anymore, thank you," he said coldly. "Nor do I like you. I guess we're back to normal," I said. "Climb in." He climbed in and we started off. I grudgingly said, "Congratulations, because it worked?" "Don't be ridiculous." It was to be expected that a plan of campaign derived from the principles of functional epistemology would be successful. All that was required was that you be at least as smart as one of Professor Pavlov's dogs, and I admit I considered that hypothesis the weak link in my chain of reasoning. We stopped for a meal from the canned stuff in the back of the car about 1 o'clock and then chugged steadily north through the ruined countryside. The little towns were wrecked and abandoned. Presumably refugees from the expanding plague area did the first damage by looting. The subsequent destruction just happened. It showed you what would just happen to any 20th century town or city in the course of a few weeks if the people who wage endless war against breakdown and dilapidation put aside their arms. It was anybody's guess whether fire or water had done more damage. Between the towns the animals were incredibly bold. There was a veritable army of rabbits eating their way across a field of clover. A farmer zombie flapped a patchwork quilt at them, saying affectionately, "Shoo, little bunnies. Go away, now." I mean it, but they knew he didn't and continued to chew their way across his field. I stopped the car and called to the farmer. He came right away, smiling. "The little dickenses," he said, waving at the rabbits. "But I haven't the heart to really scare them. Are you happy?" I asked him. "Oh yes." His eyes were sunken and bright, his cheekbones showed on his starved face. "People should be considerate," he said. "I always say that being considerate is what matters most. Don't you miss electricity and cars and tractors? Goodness, no, I always say that things were better in the old days. Life was more gracious, I always say. Why, I don't miss gasoline or electricity one little bit. Everybody's so considerate and gracious that it makes up for everything. I wonder if you'd be so considerate and gracious as to lie down in the road so we can drive over you?" He looked mildly surprised and started to get down, saying, "Well, if it would afford you gentlemen any pleasure, no. Don't bother after all. You can get back to your rabbits." He touched his straw hat and went away, beaming. We drove on. I said to the professor, Chapter 9, How to be in utter harmony with your environment. Only she didn't change herself. Professor Luton, she changed the environment. Every man and woman in the area is what Miss Phoebe thinks they ought to be, silly, sentimental, obliging and gracious to the point of idiocy. Nostalgic and all thumbs when it comes to this dreadful machinery. Norris, the professor said thoughtfully, we've been associated for some time. I think you might drop the professor and call me Luton. In a way we're friends. I jammed on the worn, mushy brakes. Out! I yelled, and we piled out. The silly glow was enveloping me fast. Again, thumb to nose and tongue out, I burned it away. When I looked at the professor and was quite sure he was a stubborn old fossil, I knew I was all right again. When he glared at me and snapped, naturally I withdraw my last remark. Norris, and no gentleman would hold me to it. I knew he was normal. We got in and kept going north. The devastation became noticeably worse after we passed a gutted, stinking shambles that had once been the town of Meshopen, Pa. After Meshopen there were more bodies on the road and the flies became a horror. No pyrethrum from Kenya. No DDT from Wilmington. We drove in the afternoon heat with the windows cranked up and the hood ventilator closed. It was at about Meshopen's radius from La Plume that things had stabilized for a while and the army engineers actually began to throw up barbed wire. Who knew what happened then? Perhaps Miss Phoebe recovered from a slight cold, or perhaps she told herself firmly that her faith in Professor Luton's wonderful book was weakening, that she must take hold of herself and really work hard at being in utter harmony with her environment. The next morning no army engineers. Zombies in uniform were glimpsed wandering about and smiling. The next morning the radius of the plague area was growing at the old mile a day. I wanted distraction from the sweat that streamed down my face. "Professor," I said, "do you remember the last word in Miss Phoebe's letter? It was forever. Do you suppose? Immortality?" "Yes, I think that is well within the range of misapplied FE. Of course complete mastery of FE ensures that no such selfish power would be invoked. The beauty of FE is its conservatism, in the kinetic sense. It is self-regulating. A world in which universal mastery of FE has been achieved, and I now perceive that the publication of my views by the Hopedale Press was if anything a step away from that ideal would be in no outward wise different from the present world. Built-in escape clause, I snapped. Like yoga. You ask them to prove they've achieved self-mastery, just a little demonstration like levitating or turning transparent, but they're all ready for you. They tell you they've achieved so much self-mastery they've mastered the desire to levitate or turn transparent. I almost wish I'd read your book, Professor, instead of just editing it. Maybe you're smarter than I thought." He turned brick red and gritted out, "Your insults merely bore me, Norris." The highway took its turn and we turned with it. I braked again and rubbed my eyes. "Do you see them?" I asked the professor. "Yes," he said matter-of-factly. "This must be the retinue of the Duchess of Carbondale." They were a dozen men shoulder to shoulder barricading the road. They were armed with miscellaneous sporting rifles and one bazooka. They wore kilt-like garments and what seemed to be bracelets from a 5 and 10. When we stopped they opened up the center of the line and the Duchess of Carbondale drove through in her chariot. Only the chariot was a harness racing sulky and she didn't drive it. The horse was led by a skinny teenage girl got up as charmian for a high school production of Antony and Cleopatra. The Duchess herself wore ample white robes, a tiara and junk jewelry. She looked like your unfavorite aunt, the fat one, or a grade school teacher you remember with loathing when you're 40, or one of those women who ring your doorbell and try to bully you into signing petitions against fluoridation or atheism in the public schools. The bazooka man had his stovepipe trained on our hood. His finger was on the button and he was waiting for the Duchess to nod. "Get out," I told the professor, grabbing my briefcase. He looked at the bazooka and we got out. "Hail, O mortals," said the Duchess. I looked helplessly at the professor. Not even my extensive experience with lady novelists had equipped me to deal with the situation. He, however, was able to take the ball. He was a European and he had status, and that's the starting point for them. Establish status and then conduct yourself accordingly. He said, "Madame, my name is Conrad Luton. I'm a doctor of philosophy of the University of Göttingen and a member of the faculty of the University of Basel. Whom have I the honor to address?" Her eyes narrowed appraisingly. "O mortal," she said, and her voice was less windily dramatic, "know ye that here in the new Lemuria worldly titles are as naught? And know ye not that the pure hearts of my subjects may not be sullied by base machinery?" "I didn't know, Madame," Luton said politely. "I apologize. We intended, however, to go only as far as La Plume. May we have your permission to do so?" At the mention of La Plume she went poker-faced. After a moment she waved at the bazooka man. "Destroy, O Frixenarts, the base machine of the strangers," she said. Frixenarts touched the button of his stovepipe. Luton and I jumped for the ditch, my hand welded to the briefcase handle, when the rocket whooshed into the poor old Ford's motor. We huddled there while the gas tank boomed and cans and bottles exploded. The noise subsided to a crackling roar and the whizzing fragments stopped coming our way after maybe a minute. I put my head up first. The Duchess and the retinue were gone, presumably melted into the roadside stand of trees. Her windy contralto blasted out, "Arise, O strangers, and join us," Luton said from the ditch, a perfectly reasonable request, Norris. "Let us do so. After all, one must be obliging, and gracious," I added. "Good old Duchess," I thought. Good old Luton. Wonderful old world, with hills and trees and bunnies and kittens and considerate people. Luton was standing on one foot, thumbing his nose, sticking out his tongue, screaming, "Norris! Norris! Defend yourself!" He was slapping my face with his free hand. Sluggishly I went into the posture of defense, thinking, such nonsense. Defense against what? But I wouldn't hurt old Luton's feelings for the world. Adrenaline boiled through my veins, triggered by the posture. Spiders. Crawling, hairy, horrid spiders with purple, venom-dripping fangs. They hid in your shoes and bit you, and your feet swelled with the poison. Their sticky, loathsome webs brushed across your face when you walked in the dark, and they came scuttling silently, champing their jaws, winking their evil gem-like eyes. Spiders. The voice of the Duchess flared impatiently. I said, "Join us, oh strangers." "Well, what are you waiting for?" The professor and I relaxed and looked at each other. "She's mad," the professor said softly. "From an asylum? I doubt it. You don't know America very well. Maybe you lock them up when they get like that in Europe. Over here we elect them chairlady of the library fund drive. If we don't, we never hear the end of it." The costumed girl was leading the Duchess's sulky onto the road again. Some of her retinue were beginning to follow. She waved them back and dismissed the girl curtly. We skirted the heat of the burning car and approached her. It was that or try to outrun a volley from the miscellaneous sporting rifles. "Oh strangers," she said, "you mentioned La Plume. Do you happen to be acquainted with my dear friend Phoebe Bancroft?" The professor nodded before I could stop him. But almost simultaneously with his nod I was dragging the Duchess from her improvised chariot. It was very unpleasant, but I put my hands around her throat and knelt on her. It meant letting go of the briefcase, but it was worth it. She guggled and floundered and managed to whoop, "Don't shoot." "I take it back, don't shoot them. Pamphilius, don't shoot, you might hit me." "Send them away," I told her. "Never." She blared. "They are my loyal retainers. You try." "Professor," I said. I believe what he put on then was his classroom manner. He stiffened and swelled and rasped toward the shrubbery, "Come out at once. All of you." They came out, shambling and puzzled. They realized that something was very wrong. There was the Duchess on the ground, and she wasn't telling them what to do the way she'd been telling them for weeks now. They wanted to oblige her in any little way they could, like shooting strangers, or scrounging canned food for her. But how could they oblige her while she lay there, slowly turning purple? It was very confusing. Luckily there was somebody else to oblige, the professor. "Go away," he barked at them. "Go far away. We do not need you anymore. And throw away your guns." Well, that was something a body could understand. They smiled and threw away their guns and went away in their obliging and considerate fashion. I eased up on the Duchess's throat. "What was that guff about the new Lemuria?" I asked her. "You're a rude and ignorant young man," she snapped. From the corner of my eye I could see the professor involuntarily nodding agreement. Every educated person knows that the lost wisdom of Lemuria was to be revived in the person of a beautiful priestess this year. According to the science of pyramidology, beautiful priestess? Oh. The professor and I stood by while she spouted an amazing compost of lost continentism, the 10 tribes, anti-fluoridation, vegetarianism, homeopathic medicine, organic fanning, astrology, flying saucers, and the prose poem of Khalil Gibran. The professor said dubiously at last, "I suppose one must call her a sort of cultural diffusionist." He was happier when he had her classified. He went on, "I think you know Miss Phoebe Bancroft. We wish you to present us to her as soon as possible." "Professor," I complained, "we have a road map and we can find La Plume. And once we've found La Plume I don't think it'll be very hard to find Miss Phoebe." "I will be pleased to accompany you," said the Duchess. "Though normally I frown on mechanical devices, I keep an automobile nearby in case of well." Of all the rude, believe it or not, she was speechless. Nothing in the rich store of gibberish and hate seemed to fit the situation. And fluoridation, organic farming, even Khalil Gibran were irrelevant in the face of us two each standing on one leg, thumbing our noses, and sticking out our tongues. Undeniably the posture of defense was losing efficiency. It took longer to burn away the foolish glow. "Professor," I asked after we warily relaxed, "how many more of those can we take?" He shrugged. "That is why a guide will be useful," he said. "Madame, I believe you mentioned an automobile." "I know," she said brightly. "It was Asana Yoga, wasn't it? Postures, I mean?" The professor sucked an invisible lemon. "No, madame," he said cadaverously. "It was neither Siddhasana nor Padmasana. Yoga has been subsumed under functional epistemology, as has every other working philosophical system, Eastern and Western, but we waste time. The automobile, you have to do that every so often, is that it? We will leave it at that. Madame. The automobile, please, come right along," she said gaily. I didn't look on her face. Madam Chairlady was about to spring a parliamentary coup. But I got my briefcase and followed. The car was in a nearby barn. It was a handsome new Lincoln, and I was reasonably certain that our fair Cicerone had stolen it. But then, we had stolen the Ford. I loaded the briefcase in and took the wheel over her objections, and we headed for La Plume, a dozen miles away. On the road she yelped, "Oh, functional epistemology and your Professor Luton." "Yes, madame." He wearily agreed. "I've read your book, of course. So has Miss Bancroft. Shall be so pleased to see you." "Then why, madame, did you order your subjects to murder us?" "Well, Professor, of course I didn't know who you were then, and it was rather shocking, seeing somebody in a car. I had the feeling that you were up to no good, especially when you mentioned dear Miss Bancroft. She, you know, is really responsible for the re-emergence of the new Lemuria." "Indeed?" said the professor. "You understand, then, about leveled personality interflow?" He was beaming. "I beg your pardon, leveled personality interflow?" he barked. Chapter 9. "Oh. In your book, of course. Well, as a matter of fact I shipped another one," muttered the professor, leaning back. The Duchess chattered on. "Dear Miss Bancroft, of course, swears by your book." "But you were asking." "No, it wasn't what you said. I cast her horoscope and it turned out that she is the 27th Pendragon, Sistrek." The professor mumbled, too discouraged to translate. "So naturally, Professor, she incarnates Taliesin spiritually and," a modest giggle, "you know who incarnates it materially. Which is only sensible, since I'm descended from the high priestesses of Mu. Little did I think when I was running the wee occult bookshop in Carbondale." "Say," said the professor. He made an effort. "Madame, tell me something. Do you never feel a certain thing, a sense of friendliness and intoxication and goodwill enveloping you quite suddenly?" "Oh," that she said scornfully. "Yes, every now and then. It doesn't bother me. I just think of all the work I have to do. How I must stamp out the dreadful, soul-destroying advocates of meat-eating, and chemical fertilizer, and fluoridation. How I must wage the good fight for occult science and crush the materialistic philosophers. How I must tear down our corrupt and self-seeking ministers and priests, our rotten laws and customs. Liebe Gott." The professor marveled as she went on. "With Norris it is spiders. With me it is rats and asphyxiation. But with this woman it is apparently everything in the cosmos except her own revolting self." She didn't hear him. She was demanding that the voting age for women be lowered to 16 and for men raised to 35. We plowed through flies and mosquitoes like smoke. The flies bred happily on dead cows and in sheep which unfortunately were still alive. There wasn't oil cake for the cows in the new Lemuria. There wasn't sheep dip for the sheep. There weren't state and county and township and village road crews constantly patrolling, unplugging sluices, clearing gutters, replacing rusted culverts, and so quite naturally the countryside was reverting to swampland. The mosquitoes loved it. "La Plume," the Duchess announced gaily. "And that's Miss Phoebe Bancroft's little house right there. Just why did you wish to see her, Professor, by the way?" "To complete her re-education," the professor said in a tired voice. Miss Phoebe's house, and the few near it, were the only places we had seen in the area which weren't blighted by neglect. Miss Phoebe, of course, was able to tell the shambling zombies what to do in the way of drug gardening, lawn mowing and maintenance. The bugs weren't too bad though. "She's probably resting, poor dear," said the Duchess. I stopped the car and we got out. The Duchess said something about Kleenex and got in again and rummaged through the glove compartment. "Please, Professor," I said, clutching my briefcase. "Play it the smart way." "The way I told you, Norris," he said. "I realize that you have my best interests at heart. You're a good boy, Norris, and I like you. Watch it." I yelled, and swung into the posture of defense. So did he. Spiders. It wasn't a good old world, not while there were loathsome spiders in it. Spiders. And a bullet shot past my ear. The professor fell. I turned and saw the Duchess looking smug, about to shoot me too. I sidestepped and she missed. As I slapped the automatic out of her hand I thought confusedly that it was a near miracle, her hitting the professor at 5 paces even if he was a standing target. People don't realize how hard it is to hit anything with a handgun. I suppose I was going to kill her or at least damage her badly when a new element intruded. A little old white-baked lady tottering down the neat gravel path from the house. She wore a nice pastel dress which surprised me. Somehow I had always thought of her in black. "Bertha." "Miss Phoebe," rapped out. "What have you done?" The Duchess simpered. "That man there was going to harm you, Phoebe, dear. And this fellow is just as bad," Miss Phoebe said. "Nonsense. Nobody can harm me." Chapter 9, Rule 7. "Bertha, I saw you shoot that gentleman. I'm very angry with you, Bertha." Very angry, the Duchess turned up her eyes and crumpled. I didn't have to check, I was sure she was dead. Miss Phoebe was once again in utter harmony with her environment. I went over and knelt beside the professor. He had a hole in his stomach and was still breathing. There wasn't much blood. I sat down and cried. For the professor. For the poor damned human race which at a mile per day would be gobbled up into apathy and idiocy. Goodbye, Newton and Einstein, goodbye steak dinners and Michelangelo and Tenzing Norgay, goodbye Moses, Rodin, Kuan Yin, transistors, Boole and Stygian. A red-headed man with an Adam's apple was saying gently to Miss Phoebe, "It's this rabbit, Mom." And indeed an enormous rabbit was loping up to him. Every time I find a turnip or something he takes it away from me and he kicks and bites when I try to reason with him, and indeed he took a piece of turnip from his pocket and the rabbit insolently poured it from his hand and nibbled it triumphantly with one wise guy eye cocked up at his victim. "He does that every time, Miss Phoebe," the man said unhappily. The little old lady said, "I'll think of something, Henry. But let me take care of these people first." "Yes, Mom," Henry said. He reached out cautiously for his piece of turnip and the rabbit bit him and then went back to its nibbling. "Young man," Miss Phoebe said to me, "what's wrong? You're giving in to despair. You mustn't do that." Chapter 9, Rule 3. I pulled myself together enough to say, "This is Professor Luton. He's dying." Her eyes widened. "The Professor Luton?" I nodded. "Or to live on the cosmic expense account?" I nodded. "Oh dear. If only there was something I could do. Heal the dying?" Apparently not. She didn't think she could, so she couldn't. "Professor," I said. "Professor." He opened his eyes and said something in German, then, hazily, "Woman shot me." "Spoil her racket, you call it? Who is this?" He grimaced with pain. "I'm Miss Phoebe Bancroft." "Professor Luton," she breathed, leaning over him. "I'm so dreadfully sorry, I admire your wonderful book so much." His weary eyes turned to me. "So, Norris," he said, "no time to do it right. We do it your way. Help me up." I helped him to his feet, suffering, I think, almost as much as he did. The wound started to bleed more copiously. "No," Miss Phoebe exclaimed. "You should lie down." The professor leered. "Good idea, baby. You want to keep me company, what's that?" She snapped. "You heard me, baby. Say, you got any liquor in your place?" "Certainly not. Alcohol is inimical to the development of the higher functions of the mind." Chapter 9, Fury on Chapter 9, baby. I just wrote that stuff for money. If Miss Phoebe hadn't been in a state resembling surgical shock after hearing that, she would have seen the pain convulsing his face. "You mean?" she quavered, beginning to look her age for the first time. "Sure. Lot of garbage. Sling fancy words and make money. What I go for is liquor and women. Women like you, baby." The goose did it, weeping, frightened, insulted and lost. She tottered blindly up the neat path to her house. I eased the professor to the ground. He was biting almost through his lower lip. I heard a new noise behind me. It was Henry, the redhead with the Adam's apple. He was chewing his piece of turnip and had hold of the big rabbit by the hind legs. He was flailing it against a tree. Henry looked ferocious, savage, carnivorous and very, very dangerous to meddle with. In a word, human. "Professor," I breathed at his waxen face, "you've done it. It's broken. Over. No more plague area," he muttered, his eyes closed. "I regret not doing it properly. But tell the people how I died, Norris. With dignity, without fear. Because of functional epistemology," I said through tears. "I'll do more than tell them, Professor. The world will know about your heroism. The world must know. We've got to make a book of this, your authentic, authorized, fictional biography, and as Hope Iddle's West Coast agent I'll see to the film sale." "Film?" he said drowsily. "Book? Yes. Your years of struggle. The little girl at home who kept faith in you when everybody scoffed. Your burning mission to transform the world, and the climax here, now. As you give up your life for your philosophy." "What girl?" he asked weakly. "There must have been someone, Professor." "We'll find someone." "You would?" he asked feebly. "Document my expulsion from Germany by the Nazis?" "Well, I don't think so, Professor. The export market's important, especially when it comes to selling film rights, and you don't want to go offending people by raking up old memories. But don't worry, Professor. The big thing is, the world will never forget you and what you've done." He opened his eyes and breathed. "You mean your version of what I've done?" "Look, Norris. Never did I think there was a power on Earth which could force me to contravene the principle of permissive evolution. His voice became stronger. But you, Norris, are that power. He got to his feet, grunting. Norris, he said, I hereby give you formal warning that any attempt to make a fictional biography or cinema film of my life will result in an immediate injunction being slapped question mark upon you, as well as suits for damages from libel, copyright infringement and invasion of privacy. I have had enough. Professor, I gasped. You're well, he grimaced. I'm sick? Profoundly sick to my stomach at my contravention of the principle of permissive. His voice grew fainter. This was because he was rising slowly into the air. He leveled off at 100 feet and called, send the royalty statements to my old address in Barl. And remember, Norris, I warned you. He zoomed eastward then at perhaps 100 miles per hour. I think he was picking up speed when he vanished from sight. I stood there for 10 minutes or so and sighed and rubbed my eyes and wondered whether anything was worthwhile. I decided I'd read the professor's book tomorrow without fail, unless something came up. Then I took my briefcase and went up the walk and into Miss Phoebe's house. Henry had made a twig fire on the lawn and was roasting his rabbit. He glared at me most disobligingly and I skirted him with care. This was, after all, the payoff. This was, after all, the reason why I had risked my life and sanity. Miss Phoebe, I said to her taking it out of the briefcase, I represent the Hopadale Press. This is one of our standard contracts. We're very much interested in publishing the story of your life, with special emphasis on the events of the past few weeks. Naturally you'd have an experienced collaborator. I believe sales in the 100,000s wouldn't be too much to expect. I would suggest as a title. That's right, you sign on that line there, how to be supreme ruler of everybody.